At the end of God's creation, describing how order emerges from chaos or being from potential, there's this strange line, which is probably the most important line that's ever been written in our culture, at the basis of our culture. And that is that men and women are made in the image of God. And what does that mean? Well, if God is that which confronts potential with truth and courage and makes what's good out of potential, that seems to indicate that we have the same faculty. Like on a smaller scale, we're not omniscient, but we're not bloody well nothing. Our conscience is integrally tied into the structure of being in some manner we don't understand. And it certainly is the case that we take what isn't and turn it into what is. That's something, man. That's quite the trick we've been able to manage. And so we're made in that image. And so what are we supposed to do? Well, that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to type our letters and make our phrases and construct our sentences and build our paragraphs and put our chapters together and make our books and communicate to people and straighten out the damn culture and constrain the malevolence and ignorance that besets each of us and push nature back and extend ourselves out into the unknown and confront the potential that's there in illimitable quantities and make the world better than it could be otherwise. To move it away from hell, and it can certainly become that, and toward heaven to the degree that we can manage that. And that is a good enough goal. That's the thing. You need something, because your life is tough. It's hard. You need something you need something to get out of bed for and fight for. And that's something, right? To fight, let's say, against hell and for heaven. That's something to fight for. You want to be convinced about this. Like read a little bit about hell. Read the Gulag Archipelago, or read Ordinary Men, or read The Rape of Nanking, or read about what happened in Nazi Germany during Auschwitz and all the catastrophes of the 20th century, and see if you believe in hell, and see if you think, well, maybe not having that happen anymore would be a good idea. And then think about maybe that's something you could contribute to. Then it wouldn't have to happen anymore. And that would be a good thing, and God only knows what great things we could manage under such conditions. We're becoming incredibly technologically powerful. What would it be like if we became equally wise? Well, that would really be something. God only knows what we could manage in the next 20 years or the next 100 years, We're running at 40%, most of us, because we're half in and half out. And it's not surprising, because life is difficult. It's like, well, what if you were 90% in, or 95% in, or all in? Because you're all in anyways, right? It's a life and death game. No one gets out of this. Everyone dies. You might as well commit yourself. And you might as well commit yourself to the highest good that you can attain, because why not? It'll imbue your life with meaning. It's hard, the responsibility's there, but all the meaning's in the responsibility. And that'll make your life better. It'll make your family's life better. And it should make your culture better. Maybe it make the world better. It's like, that'll justify your damn miserable existence at 3 o'clock in the morning when you're wondering what the hell you're doing here. And that's a good thing, because there's going to be days when you're aching and tired and sore, and there's people in your family that are sick, and you're cynical and bitter, and you need a reason to get up, and you think, yeah, well, a little more heaven and a little less hell, maybe I can pull that off today and tomorrow and next week, and that's worth struggling forward for. And so that's how it looks to me.
Need motivation? Watch a top 10 with Believe Nation. Hey, it's Evan Carmichael, and I make these videos because you are probably the most ambitious person in your circle, but you know you're capable of more, and you get that push by surrounding yourself with the best. So today, let's learn from one of the best, Jordan Peterson, and my take on his top 10 rules of success. Enjoy. Rule number 2, treat yourself like you matter.
My rule 2 is treat yourself as if you're someone responsible for helping. And it's sort of predicated on the idea that regardless of your inadequacies and your malevolence, which, I'm sure you have many inadequacies and no shortage of malevolence, just like everyone else. Regardless of that, you have a moral obligation, so that would be a responsibility, to assume that despite all evidence, that there's actually something of intrinsic worth about you, and that as a consequence, you're duty bound to treat yourself like that is true. And then it turns out that if you do that, well, then your life gets better. And I don't mean happier exactly, although I would say it gets happier. I mean it gets richer and more meaningful and deeper and more worthwhile, and you become more educated and you become wiser, and you treat yourself with more respect, and you're a better model for other people, and you're a better father or better sister or better mother, whatever it happens to be. And you're less ridden by that guilt that gnaws at you, and shame that's there otherwise saying, you're not what you could be, you're not what you could be. And that's a hell of a voice to get rid of, and it's certainly not one that's easy to ignore. So that's a pretty good, that idea that there's something divine, let's say, that resides within you of ultimate worth. Even as a philosophical statement or a psychological statement rather than a metaphysical statement, it seems to be a precondition for establishing properly harmonious relationships with yourself. And that's worth thinking about a lot, that you have to, because you could think that in some sense you just own yourself, because people do kind of make that claim, especially when they're trying to justify, for example, their right to suicide, that, it's your life, it's your body, you're yours to do what you will with. And if that was true, well, then it would seem to me that life would be a lot more straightforward, because you would just tell yourself things that you would instantly obey and believe. So first of all, you'd tell yourself all the things that you were going to do, and then you just run off and do them, which you don't, obviously, because it's much more difficult at that. And then you'd also say, well, enough of the guilt and the shame and the negative emotion and the disillusionment and the vengefulness and all those things that make life hard, especially the self-recrimination. It's like, what the hell do we need that for? And if we're our masters of our own destiny and owners of our own fate, then why can't we just command to ourselves that be dispensed with? And that doesn't work. I've never seen anybody able to do that. So, you can fool yourself for very brief periods of time into thinking that might work, but it doesn't work. And that's strange. And this is one of the reasons I love the psychoanalysts, because they were really the people, apart from the religious types, who figured out that whatever you are, you're not a unitary spirit that's under your own dominion. You're something like a loose unity of a multiplicity of spirits, many of which are doing their own thing, which you're striving to bring into some form of unity. But even that unity isn't something that's under your control in any real sense. It's a unity that has its own nature that you have to exist in relationship to. And I would also say that that's one of the things that keeps people's feet firmly on the ground, because otherwise it's easy to become egotistical and narcissistic. If you think that you're the center of your own being, in some fundamental sense, then you're only beholden to yourself. You're sort of a self-created creature. Perhaps you could think about it that way. But it doesn't work like that. It's like the ideal that constitutes the unity that you might become then sort of manifests itself as something that you could strive toward, but aren't. And it also serves as a judge. It's the thing that keeps you up at night saying, there's some things you're just not attending to, and you should get at it, because life is short and there's no shortage of trouble that you might end up in, and a wise person would attend to the dictates of his conscience and lay out his actions in the world according to what he knows to be true and correct. And that is how people think. And it isn't obvious why we think that way. This is part of the reason that it seems to me so obvious that we have a religious instinct, because I can't think of what else you would possibly call that other than a religious instinct.
Rule number 3, be selfless.
The notion that our morality is linked to our desire to survive I'm perfectly fine with that. The devil's in the details to some degree. One of the fields of endeavor that I've been particularly struck by is the work of people like Frans de Waal. And Frans de Waal has written a series, and also Jaak Panksepp. Hey, I'll tell you something cool about rats. Some of you, I'd like to do that. Some of you have probably heard this before, but this affective neuroscientist named Jaak Panksepp, he studied rats for a long time, and he's a very sophisticated researcher, and I think he was one of the greatest neuroscientists who lived in the last 50 years. I don't think there's really any question of that. He might have been one of the top 3. He'd be in the top 3. It'd be a tight race up at the top 3. He did this great experiment. It was so smart. So, juvenile rats like to play, and they like to wrestle. They like to engage in rough and tumble play. And you might say, well, how do you know a rat likes to do something? It's like, or you're anthropomorphizing. And the first thing I would say to that is you should anthropomorphize unless there's evidence to the contrary, because we share a biological platform with rats, and they're a lot like us. And a rat is a lot more like you than your stupid model of a human being is like a human being. So you try building a rat. It's hard. So anyways, you can tell rats want to play because if you put them in a little arena where they can rough and tumble play and wrestle, and then you bring them there the next time and you make them work to open the door to play, they'll work. And so that's how we know you like something. You'll work for it, so you can apply that to rats. And they'll work hard for it. And rats deprived of play, their prefrontal cortexes don't mature. And they're kind of hyperactive, which might tell us something about boys in school, but we won't go into that. If you take a rat of the same age as another rat, and you put them in a play area, but the other rat has a 10% weight advantage, the big rat will pin the little rat. And they actually pin each other, pretty much like dogs do when they're wrestling. Well, they don't pin quite as much, but humans certainly do it. And pin means dominance, or that's one interpretation. You only make that interpretation if you think that the hierarchies that rats live in are dominance hierarchies predicated on the expression of power. And we all kind of think that because we use the term dominance hierarchy. But, that's a political term as well as a scientific term, and it's predicated on the notion that the fundamental basis of hierarchical structure among mammals and other complex organisms is power, and that's wrong. And it's not just wrong, it's corrosively wrong. It's misleadingly wrong. It's seriously and not acceptably wrong. Anyways, you pair the rats once and you think, hey, big rat wins over little rat, establishes dominance, that's the basis of the relationship. But the thing about rats is, like people, they don't just play once because they live in social groups that are reciprocal. They play repeatedly. And Panksepp, being a very smart researcher, realized this, so he paired rats to play, the same rats, over multiple occasions. And the first thing he observed was the second time the rats got together, the little rat had to invite the big rat to play. And rats do the same sort of thing that dogs do when they want to play. And that play behavior is so cross-species common that all of you know when your dog wants to play. You can take your dog and whack him like that if you do it right, and he goes and tries to bite you, but not really, right? He plays and his tail's wagging. And when dogs are playing, it kind of looks like dominance behavior like it does among boys, because boys really like to rough and tumble play, by the way, although girls like it too, but not as much. You can distinguish the play behavior from aggression, and if you can't, that means you never had any friends. I mean that. That's what it means. That's what it means, because part of being able to have friends is to be able to identify aggression versus play. And part of playing is to pretend to be aggressive quite aggressively, but still be playing, right? There's a tremendous social skill in that. Anyways, the little rat has to ask the big rat to play, which I imagine is somewhat, humiliating for the little rat, but he's the little rat, so tough luck for him. And the big rat can deign to play, and then they play. And then you can observe how they play over repeated bouts. If the big rat doesn't let the little rat win at least 30% of the time, even though he could win 100% of the time, the little rat will no longer invite him to play. And you think, yeah. It's like, no, not yeah. Like the emergence of morality in rats through play. That's a big discovery, man. That's a big discovery. And there's that reciprocity, that exists within the rat hierarchy. And stable hierarchies in complex mammals are not predicated on power. So Frans de Waal has showed quite clearly that, so chimps have a pretty rough hierarchy, and it's pretty male-dominated. Now, bonobos are quite different. We won't talk about them because it's not germane to this particular point. But you might think, the biggest chimpanzee with the biggest teeth, he's the tyrant. He's the winner. And that happens sometimes. There are tyrannical chimpanzee societies. But what de Waal has shown quite clearly is that I don't care how big and tough you are. If you don't play fair, two guys 90% your size can get together one day when you're not feeling so well and tear you into bits. And that's exactly what happens among the chimps. So tyranny, that can be a route to dominance. It can even be a route to sexual access, because it is the case among chimpanzees that males who are higher in the power hierarchy are more likely to father offspring, not because the female chimps choose them, because female chimps aren't choosy, unlike human females. It's a profound difference between the two species, but because that more superordinate male chimps chase the subordinates away. So, but de Waal has shown quite clearly that the males who manage to occupy positions of authority and competence longest in chimpanzee hierarchies are intensely reciprocal with the other males, more so than the other chimps in the hierarchy. They do a lot of mutual grooming and are preferentially attentive to the females and their infants. And so even among chimps, and chimps can be damn brutal, right? Jane Goodall discovered, I think it was 1975, another landmark in late 20th century science, that, and this was a real blow to the social constructionist utopians. Juvenile chimps patrol the borders of their territory, and if they come across chimps from other troops and outnumber them, they will tear them into bits. And chimps are unbelievably strong, and it's unbelievably brutal. And so Goodall basically discovered that chimps have the human the equivalent of human tribal warfare. And that's quite frightening if you're sensible, because you might be the kind of optimist who thinks that human conflict is caused by capitalism or some bloody daft notion like that. And wouldn't that be lovely? Because then it would be, you could just get rid of it by getting rid of capitalism, which you wouldn't be able to do anyways. But you know what I mean. We split from chimps about 7 million years ago. And if the problem of intergroup aggression is that deep, it's a terrible problem.
Rule number 4, enforce positive behavior.
And this is another thing you can do in your own household. This is so useful, man. If you get good at doing this, your life will get so much better. You can't believe it. Is watch the people around you, and whenever they do anything that you would like to see repeated on a regular basis, tell them exactly what they did in detail, with, be positive about it, obviously, and just indicate that you noticed. And because I saw this when I was grading student essays, and so I taught this seminar for a long time, and I was trying to teach kids how to write. They were in their 4th year of university in the honors psych program. You'd think they'd bloody well already know how to write, but they didn't. And so I'd have them write a 4-page essay on a given topic, and then they had to rewrite that to a 6-page essay, and then they had to rewrite that to an 8-page essay. And the first essay I graded, it was only 5% of their grade, and I told them, I'm going to cut you into ribbons, but it doesn't matter because it's 5% of your grade, and so they could tolerate that. And generally, by the 3rd essay, they had written the best thing they'd ever written in their life, and they learned so fast it was unbelievable. But one of the things I noticed was that they did a little testing with the first essay. They'd hand in something. It was just like, God, formulaic, boring. They weren't in it at all. There was nothing of the person in there. There was no thought. There was just the kind of psychobabble that they'd learned, especially if they were in faculties of education. And it was dry and dull, and everything about it was wrong. And so those are hard to grade, right? It's like, what's wrong with my essay? The words aren't right, the phrases, they're not so good, they're not organized well into sentences, the sentences aren't sequenced well in the paragraphs don't make a coherent argument, and the entire thing is empty. But other than that, no problem. It was often easier just to rewrite those essays than to grade them. So in any case, though, one of the things I did learn was that even in an essay like that, there is usually like one sentence or two sentences buried on like page 3 that was an actual thought and reasonably clearly stated and somewhat gripping, It was like the person popped out from all the background rubbish and said, well, what about this? And if you saw that and checked it and said, hey, you hit the mark right there, the next essay would be like 2/3 that. And that was really fun to see. And then maybe by the third essay, maybe it was all like that. And then they were really thrilled. It's like, wow, I wrote this, And it was sort of the culmination. Well, it was a 4th-year seminar. It was the culmination of their career as a psychology undergraduate. So that was great fun. But you can do that in your own household. If the envious part of you isn't jealous of the revelation of the goodness of the person.
Also, to make sure you're actually taking action after watching this video, I've designed a special free worksheet just for this video. The worksheet will highlight all of the lessons learned in this video, as well as pull out our 3 favorite learnings and quotes that will inspire you to actually do something. The worksheet will also give you space to write down what your key takeaways are and your specific plan of action to make sure you're getting results. If you want the worksheet designed specifically for this video, absolutely for free, there's a link in the description below. Go click on it and start building the momentum in your life and your business. I'll see you there. Rule number 5, confront problems.
For me, as a clinical psychologist, I've always looked at things, I think, in some ways from the opposite perspective of most, and maybe even most psychologists. It's never been a mystery to me why people are depressed. It's never been a mystery to me why people are anxious and unsettled. It seems obvious why they're concerned and hurt and anxious and unsettled. I think the mystery is how it is that we can conduct ourselves so that that can remain under control. I mean, people deal with very heavy burdens in their life. You don't have to talk to someone for very long. Someone you might be thinking is doing quite well in the world, and sometimes people are. But you don't have to scratch very deep beneath the surface before you find out that they have a family member who has a serious illness, or someone who's suffering through an economic crisis of one form or another, or who there's some source of genuine tragedy 1 degree removed from them, if it's even removed. And most people, even as individuals, have at least one serious problem that they're dealing with. And so it's no mystery that people find it difficult to orient themselves in the world. And the mystery is, well, what can you do about it? And we do know what you can do about it. And Jonathan Haidt wrote a book recently. Now, I'm afraid that it's the name of the book has escaped me. It's about the college situation and the snowflake culture. And one of the things that he pointed out, along with Luginov, who's his co-author, was that if you're a psychotherapist of any sort, particularly a behavior therapist, what you help people do is to identify their problems. That's the first thing, is to confront what's there, the reality of what's there, as bluntly as possible. And so you often end up, as a psychotherapist, talking to people about their array of problems. It's as if they're putting their cards on the table. And you sort out their problems. It's like, and no, they often decide that many of the things that are bothering them are not really that important. They can wait, but that there are crucial life challenges that present themselves to them. And they're not just psychological problems, although sometimes they are. They're problems in life, right? Existential problems. And then what you do is you help people break them down into manageable units, let's say, strategically, and confront them voluntarily.
You know, and there's an echo of that idea. There's an echo of that in Christian thinking, and the echo for that is to pick up your cross voluntarily, which is that you have an unavoidable mortal burden to bear in life. There's no escape from it except to directly confront it and to take it on voluntarily. And what's so fascinating about that, two things. One is that psychotherapists of every stripe understand that this is one of the primary reasons that psychotherapy works. There's no dispute about that among all the different psychotherapeutic schools, is that the confrontation of existential problems, voluntary confrontation, is curative. And that's really something. And so, and the practical aspect of that is quite straightforward. It also indicates, practical and philosophical, it also indicates to you that there's far more to you than you think. Because it turns out that you have substantial problems, genuine, deep problems of malevolence and suffering, but that if you decide that you will take that on as your responsibility, that you can put yourself together psychologically, just the courage, and you can actually solve the problems. And that seems to be true. It's not a naive wish. It seems to be well within our capacity. And I mean, that's part of the message, I would say, of 12 Rules for Life, is that dark as things are, there's more light in you than you know what to do with, and there's more light in you than you can possibly manifest. And the way to find that out is to challenge yourself against these massive problems and to find out that you're the one that can deal with them.
Rule number 6, read valuable books.
I don't know how many of you have read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, but I would highly recommend that. In Crime and Punishment, the protagonist commits the perfect murder, and he has his reasons for it, and many reasons, because Dostoevsky didn't mess around. When he wanted to give someone reasons, he gave them reasons, and Raskolnikov, the main character, had reasons for murder. And then he commits his murder, and he gets away with it. But things don't go well for Raskolnikov, because one of the things he finds out is that the Raskolnikov that you were before you committed the murder is not the same as the Raskolnikov as you are after you've committed the murder. And there's a dividing line there that you don't. It's like the red pill, I guess, right? It's that's the Matrix, correct? The red pill. And once there's certain actions, once you take them, there's no going back. And so that's what Crime and Punishment is about. And Raskolnikov tortures himself to death, well, not literally, but metaphysically, psychologically, because he cannot tolerate breaking the great moral code. And so it's a great book. It's truly a great book, and it's also extraordinarily, like it's a murder mystery thriller as well as being a deep philosophical book. So if you're in the mood for a murder mystery thriller that's also a deep philosophical book, then that's the one for you.
Rule number 7, find meaning.
You need that instinct for meaning too. So and we should get this real straight. Why do you need it? Well, you need it because life is really, really difficult, right? I mean, people have a rough time of it. There's plenty of suffering in life, and everyone is going to encounter it, right? You learn this as a clinical psychologist, and you know this generally, unless you're an extraordinarily fortunate person. You don't have to talk to someone for very long and really talk to them and get beneath the surface until you find there's a tragedy or 2 or 3 or 10 lurking not very far beneath the surface. Someone in the family is very ill. There's a childhood history of extreme pathology, alcoholism somewhere in the family, maybe a touch of insanity. Someone has cancer. Some older relative is dying. There's financial trouble. There's economic trouble. There's marital trouble. It's like life is trouble. And now, that doesn't mean it's all trouble, but man, it's trouble. And sometimes it's a lot of trouble. And sometimes it's so much trouble that you you can barely stand it. And you see that because people get depressed and they commit suicide. And the reason they do that is because they think not being is better than being. And that's quite the decision, So, and it's not that uncommon among people who are depressed. And so it's a very important thing to consider. And it isn't just a matter of depression and suicide. That's bad enough. But, if you're unhappy because your suffering has pushed you past the point of your ability to cope, then there's all sorts of other things that can happen to you that aren't directed towards you. You can become cynical, and you can become bitter, and you can become cruel, and you can become narcissistic and deceitful and arrogant, and it's like everything's for you, and then you're out for revenge. That's a nice one. I don't know against who, but maybe everyone. Maybe even including you, because you're not happy about the role you've played in generating your own misery. I mean, there's a lot of darkness underneath the suffering. And so, and that's an ever-present existential danger for human beings, We're aware of the future, we're aware of our fragility, we're aware of our mortality. It's something that makes us truly unique, truly conscious in a way that no other creature is, and capable of things that no other creature can do, but also bearing an unbelievably heavy existential load. We're the only creatures that have to always contend with the fact that we're finite and that everyone we know is in the same position, that allied with the suffering. And so that's there all the time. And even in the brightest moments, in some sense, in Renaissance paintings, in still lifes, they used to put a memento mori often in the still life, like a skull somewhere in the corner, or sometimes in a very strange perspective, so that you could only see the skull if you were standing like right beside the painting instead of dead on. But the idea was to always remember, that everything that exists is tainted or touched with the taint of mortality. And that's rough, but there's some useful things in it. It keeps you awake and it keeps you focused if you're careful. But it also does indicate to you, if you think about it, the necessity of having a meaning in your life. Because if it's true intrinsically that life has this unbearable element of suffering, which seems to be completely in what would you say, indisputable as far as I'm concerned, and it's worse than that too, because it's not just suffering, it's suffering contaminated with malevolence, right? It's bad enough to have something bad happen to you, and it's likely that that'll happen, but it's even worse for you to do it to yourself and to know that you did it. That's rough. And it's also extraordinarily rough to be betrayed by someone else, or tyrannized by your own culture. And that's not just suffering, that's like unnecessary and pointless suffering that's being directed at you by something that wants that to happen. And so both of those are very, very powerful, let's say, archetypal forces, suffering and malevolence, and we have to deal with them at every level of reality. And you need something to push back against that. It's not optional, if that's the default position, and I think it's the default position. Like, a meaningless life isn't meaningless. It's suffering and malevolence. That's not good. And if that's acted out, that's the other thing. If that's acted out, and I've read the accounts and the actions of people who've taken a very vicious turn into the darkest parts of the underworld, consequence of their resentment and their malevolence, and then their desire to make everything in the world suffer for the outrage of its existence, man. I mean, that's how we turn things into hell. If you want to know why totalitarian states take the brutal twists they take, and why people are motivated to do the absolutely terrible things that they do, well, that's why, is that the suffering and the malevolence that's intrinsic to life overwhelms them, and they turn in a very bad direction, and then they make everything that's already bad way worse, and we're very, very inventive at such things. And so that's not good, unless that's the path you want. That's a bad idea. You need an alternative, and that's meaning.
Rule number 8, aim to serve.
Part of the cultural battle that we all find ourselves enveloped in is partially due to the claim that there's virtually nothing other than the lust for power. And, I would say, fair enough, in some limited sense, that bears directly on your question, because you see that as a temptation that might be powerful enough to bend and distort you as you attempt to make your way through, let's say, the halls of power. Well, I heard recently from a reliable source that Putin's conversion to Orthodox Christianity might be genuine. And then you might think, well, if you're atheistic, well, that's not necessarily a good thing, or maybe you think it's a bad thing, or maybe you think it's an irrelevant issue, and you may also think it's a lie. But I would say that I would be more inclined to trust someone who thinks there's something higher than himself. And then you might say, well, what is it that's higher than ourselves? And that's worth thinking about. And we all need to think about this, regardless of the particulars of our religious belief. And I would say, again, from a clinical perspective, service to others is really something. People who are depressed tend to use the pronouns I and me much more frequently than people who aren't depressed. And I'm not saying that people get depressed because they're selfish. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that one of the routes out of depression appears to be an increase in service to other people. And I think the reason for that is because we aren't power-mad demons at the core, even though we may be tempted by such things, and that we find the genuine meaning that offsets genuine suffering in the genuine service to others. And I think it's a big mistake to be cynical, especially prematurely, about such things as political activity, because they're necessary, despite, let's say, their adversarial and party-centered nature, partisan nature. You have to be clear about what you serve and why. And that has to be held higher always than mere victory, mere operationalized victory or instrumental victory. And it's a very, very difficult thing to negotiate, particularly because in the political realm, in some sense, you have to defeat your enemy, right? Because you have to win the election and the other people have to lose. It's a binary choice. But so often I see in partisan discussion the proclivity to assume that all the ill will and malevolence resides on the other side of the chamber. And that's a big mistake. And you could think about that more deeply too, is that we all need a place to place the existence of malevolence, right? Because malevolence clearly exists, and we all suffer from the weight of malevolent history, right? Because even the grounds we walk on here, which this is a remarkable and wonderful place, I mean, English soil is soaked with blood, just like the soil of every place in the world. That's part of the human heritage, and all of us bear the marks of that conflict in some sense in our souls, partly because of the possibility for us to engage in that, but also partly because part of the reason we're here in all this privilege is because of all that catastrophe. Well, the best way to localize that malevolence is inside you, right? And to remember that the enemy that you're fighting with, the greatest enemy that you ever fight with, is in your own heart. And that'll also stop you from confusing that true source of malevolence, let's say, with your mere political enemies. And that isn't to say that you won't encounter malevolent behavior, although most of it in the political sphere, as it is everywhere, most of it is more ignorance than malevolence, although willful blindness certainly plays a large role. And so you need to know what it is that you're serving. And I would say one of the ways to do that practically, or a couple of ways to do that practically, is you need a good team around you, the people you really trust and who can watch you, and who do it with a certain degree of impartiality, and who are disagreeable enough to talk to you when you do something wrong. So you need trusted advisors. And then the other thing I would say is you really need to listen to your constituents, because they will tell you what the problems are if you listen to them. And if you really listen to them, well, then you'll have your feet on the ground, which is where they should be, and you'll know what the problems are, and you will win elections. Because what people really want from their leaders is to be listened to, and then for those leaders to articulate what they've heard in the halls of, let's say, influence and power. And so if you know those things, if you know you need to listen, you need to get in touch with the people you're representing as regularly as you possibly can, and mostly to listen. I knew a man in Canada who started a political party which is a very difficult thing to do. And not only did he start it, but he rode it to sufficient success so that he became the leader of the opposition in Canada within about 10 years. And I asked him how he did that, because it's like, well, really, how did you do that? That's actually really hard. And he said he would go out from constituency to constituency and make his stump speeches, but what he really liked was the Q&As, because people would tell him what their problems were. Then he knew what the problems were. And out of the dialogue would also emerge the answers that the audience found compelling. And so not only would they tell him what the problems were, but they would tell him the answers they would like to have what instituted to solve those problems. It's the same thing that comedians do when they finesse their acts in front of live audiences before they practice them in front of a large audience. They tell jokes, and the audience either laughs or they don't. And if they laugh, then you keep that joke, and if they don't, you throw it out. And soon you're just as funny as the audience can possibly manage. And it's the same thing. You can also do that in a dark manner, by the way, which is what Hitler did. So he could utter terrible things and wait for a response and collect those. And so then you become the embodiment of the shadow of your people. So I would recommend that you probably don't do that.
Rule number 9, be guided by love.
You speak about the concept of the soul. Do you associate this with any psychological constructs?
Not any psychological constructs that are more valid than the notion of the soul. No, there's, I would say, what we mean by soul is something like animating spirit. And you might say, well, what's a spirit? And well, that's actually rather easy to answer. So when a child of 4 is playing house, let's say when a child of 4 is playing house, she acts out the role of the mother. But acting out, that's a strange thing, right? Because she doesn't literally duplicate in her actions or her perceptions in the game what she observed her mother literally doing. So, for example, she didn't go into her mother's bedroom when her mother awoke and watched her turn her head in a particular way to awaken and count the number of blinks so that she could mimic that in her play. And you think that's absurd, but it's not absurd if it's just mimicry. It's not. It's unbelievably sophisticated. So what the girl does is she watches her mother manifest maternal behavior across a vast array of instances, and she integrates that with the image of the mother she's received from all the books she's been read and all the little movies she's watched, the Disney movies and so forth, and she abstracts out the animating principle of the maternal, and then she embodies that in play, and usually with a little boy, and that's practice for what's going to come later. It's unbelievably sophisticated, and she's embodying a spirit, and the spirit there is the abstraction of the central animating principle from multiple embodiments of its manifestation. And if you think children can't do that, well, then you don't know anything about children, because they do that all the time in their pretend play, which is a necessary precursor to healthy psychological development. And so part of what we refer to as the soul is the presence of that spirit, or maybe even the capacity of embodying such spirits. And it's very difficult to know how deep that goes. I had a vision at one point of all the men in my life who've been particularly influential in a benevolent way. And you think, well, just the mere notion of the idea that there could be a benevolent way that would unite the acts of benevolence across a series of men, that's all comprehensible to you. You take that as a matter of course when you say that there are such things as good men, and you can identify them, right? Something stable about whatever is good across multiple manifestations of incarnation, let's say. And I saw that transform into the Father person of the Trinity as the embodiment of that benevolent spirit. Now, I don't have any idea what that means metaphysically, because who does? But that spirit manifesting itself within is certainly part of what we refer to when we talk about the soul. And you can see that shine through people. I mean, it's part of what gives someone charisma. It's part of what elicits the instinct to imitate in you. And you see that even in simple things. When you see a remarkable athlete do something incredibly athletic to put the soccer ball, the football ball through the net to score the goal, and everybody leaps to their feet in celebration of that, well, that's That's a celebration of the divine capacity to hit the target dead on. And it grips you at such a low level, way down inside your soul, that you're compelled to your feet to cheer, and you don't even know what you're doing. But you enjoy it, that's for sure. And that enjoyment is also a sign of the depth and utility of that response. You see this in all the things that people do that are, so-called popular entertainment. It's unbelievably sophisticated. The soul is participating in that in the fullest extent. And, you can say, well, there's no necessary use for the religious terminology. It's like, well, until you come up with a better word, there's plenty of use for it, because it's a very complex and deep phenomena. And to, just cast it into the realm of superstition in some casual manner it's just not helpful. Not in any possible, it's not helpful scientifically, it's not helpful ethically, it's not helpful existentially. Try treating someone for a while as if they don't have a soul. Just really, I mean it, just, treat them like a deterministic machine, if that's your belief. Really act it out. You'll be like the most hated person in town in about 15 minutes. Well, I mean, what do you make of practical evidence like that? I mean, you interact with people as if they're free souls capable of choosing between good and evil. That's what you do all the time. And maybe you can addle yourself out of that by some ridiculous rationalist ideology, but that just means you're kind of a gabbling fool, and it's just going to make you trip over things you don't even notice in all of your social interactions. And you tell me, I don't care how you think philosophically or ideologically, you bloody well know that what I just said is true. So, and that's true even when you're interacting with an infant or a small child. It's true when you're dealing with someone who's elderly and virtually incapacitated in every way. You still see that divine spark, for lack of a better term, and we do lack a better term, by the way. You see that everywhere if your eyes are open and if you're willing to see it, and to the degree that you're responsive to that, then your actions are guided by love and your words are guided by truth.
And rule number 10, the last one before some very special bonus clips, is act on what you believe.
Human consciousness is that faculty that confronts potential itself. I think there's good neurological evidence for this, by the way, for those of you who are scientifically minded, because we build circuits within us for habitual action that we've practiced many times that seem to run in a very deterministic fashion. And we are a strange combination of deterministic and non-deterministic as far as I can tell. But what our consciousness seems to be for is to encounter those things that we have not yet encountered. And those things that we have not yet encountered seem to me to be those things that have not yet been brought into being. And so you could say that what our consciousness is for the encounter with potential. That our consciousness is it's not for the past, it's not even for the present. It's to transform the future into the present. And really that's what our consciousness does. When you wake up in the morning, you have a new day ahead of you, and the day could take you in very many directions. And the weeks and the years, all of that can take you in very many directions. And you have some apprehension about what those directions might be. You have some apprehension about what role your choices might make in transforming that potential into one form of actuality or another. I mean, you certainly know that there are dreadful mistakes that you might be very tempted to make that would produce all manner of hell around you and still be tempted to do it. It seems like it's sitting there right in front of you as a possibility. You also know that, you could haul yourself up out of bed and attend to your duties and do the sorts of things that you're supposed to and set a few things right that day and that week, and that likely things would at least not be worse and they would probably be better. And I do believe that I don't understand how this can be the case. I don't understand how it is that consciousness can function in that way, because I think to understand that, we would have to understand what it means for the future to be only potential rather than actuality, and who the hell understands that? I mean, no one. And then we'd have to understand how it is that our conscious choices and our conscious ethical choices transform that potentiality into
actuality, into reality, into the present and the past. And we certainly act as if we believe that that's what we do. We upbraid ourselves. For example, when we do a bad job of it, we're upset with our children and those we love if we don't believe that they're living up to their potential. We're guilty and ashamed when we make choices that we feel are inappropriate. We understand to some degree that the manner in which time lays itself out has something to do with the ethics of our choice. And again, I would say that's a very deep idea. I think it's the most true idea I know. It's very emphasized, that idea emphasized in ancient religious stories such as those that are outlined in Genesis, or in Genesis with its strange insistence that, God is that which brings order out of chaos, formless potential, generates the world out of formless potential, and that we're somehow made in that image, which seems to me to be the case. And that the proper way, by the way, to go about acting in that image is to act in relationship to the potential that confronts you with truth and with courage, with careful articulation. That's the logos. And that if you do that, then what you bring forth is good.
Compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. And the reason I wrote that was because I had this client, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've spent 20 hours a week for 25 years listening to people tell me about their lives, and those people were people who were just barely hanging on to the bottom of the world, up to people who were so successful you can hardly believe it, like the entire gamut of people. And that's been absolutely fascinating. It's like being a clinical psychologist, if you really listen, is like being immersed in a Dostoevsky novel all the time, because it's amazing what people will tell you if you listen to them. People are so interesting if you actually listen to them, because they're so peculiar. They're like penguins or rhinoceroses or ostriches. They're unlikely creatures. And anyways, with regards to comparing yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today, this old client of mine, he was about 85 when he came to see me, and he was a financier and a kind of a mathematical genius. He made these little pendants out of a mathematical symbol for the most beautiful mathematical equation that was ever written. He made them out of gold, and he would hand those out. And he had studied psychology as a young man, and he introduced me to this concept that I didn't know about, called the Pareto distribution, which, see, I'd been taught as a psychologist that most human characteristics were normally distributed, right? So most people were average and some people were extreme. That's a Pareto, or a normal distribution. Intelligence is like that, and height, there's more people of average height than very tall or very short, and weight is like that, and lots of things are normally distributed, and psychologists tend to assume that everything is, but it isn't. Creative products are distributed in a Pareto distribution, and that's a whole different thing, and it's really important to know this. It's another fundamental fact, the knowledge of which can sort of transform the way you conceptualize, let's say, the political landscape. So here's an example of the Pareto distribution. There's a rule of thumb that if you run a company, that 20% of your employees do 80% of the work, or that 20% of your customers are responsible for 80% of your sales, or that 20% of them are responsible for 80% of the customer service calls. Same thing, but that's not exactly the rule. The rule is worse than that. The rule is, in a given domain, the square root of the number of people operating in that domain do half the productive work. So you think, well, you have 10 employees, 3 of them do half the work. It's like, yeah, okay. What if you have 100 employees? Then 10 of them do half the work. What if you have 1,000 employees? Well, then it's 30. And if it's 10,000 employees, then it's 100. And this actually turns out to be a rather ironclad rule. It applies across very, very many situations. It applies, for example, to the mass of stars and the size of cities.
So you can see how universal it is as a law. And it's something like those that have more get more, and those that have less get less. That's the Matthew principle, right? To those who have everything, more will be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken away. And the economists sometimes call that the Matthew principle. And so what that lays out is a world that's rife with inequality. So you hear this idea that I think it's the 85 richest people in the world have more money than the bottom 2 billion. That's a Pareto distribution phenomena. And you might say, to hell with capitalism for producing that. It's like, sorry, you got your diagnosis wrong. It's a natural law. It's no matter what society you study, you get a Pareto distribution of wealth. You get a Pareto distribution of number of records recorded. You get a Pareto distribution of number of songs written or goals scored. Like any creative product has that characteristic. And it's partly because as you start to become successful, let's say, people offer you more and more opportunities. And as you start to fail, people move away from you and you plummet. And so, okay, so that's rough. So what it means is that there is always a landscape of inequality. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do anything about it, although I am saying that we don't know what to do about it. That's the thing, because you can modify the Pareto distribution of wealth, let's say, but we don't know how to do it without maybe disrupting the system so completely that it collapses, which is what happened in the Soviet Union, for example, and in Maoist China. They were trying, at least in principle, to adjust inequality. But the cure was far worse than the disease. And the truth of the matter is we actually don't know technically how much inequality there has to be to generate wealth. We can guess, and you could say, well, there should be less, and you might say, well, there should be more. If you're left-wing, you'd say less, and if you're right-wing, you'd say, well, we'll just let the inequality flourish. But we do know that it's inevitable, and we also know that we don't know how to regulate it. So, there is inequality. What that means is there's always going to be people around that are better at something than you are. And that's a problem, because you can get jealous and you can get bitter and you can get resentful, and worse, you can get hopeless, because you look like I have this friend of mine. He told me something so funny. He was decrying his lack of success in the world, and he compared himself to his roommate. And he said, his college roommate was doing much better than he was. And his bloody roommate was Elon Musk. It's like, really? It's like, oh, you're not doing as well as Elon Musk. Well, you can see he would take it rather personally because they were roommates and everything. It wasn't like he was doing badly. Like he was doing pretty damn well. It's like, I'm not as good as Elon Musk. It's like, yeah, well, you and like 7 billion other people, But I thought it was instructive because you have to be careful who you compare yourself to. Now, you can't just not compare yourself to successful people, right? Because then you don't have anything to aim at.
Soul is also the center of the world, which is a frightening proposition and not one that's easily comprehensible. Solzhenitsyn's work in the Gulag Archipelago is particularly enlightening in this regard, because he insisted that it was a preconception of our Judeo-Christian heritage that each person was a center of the cosmos. And you can think of that as a center of consciousness, right? A center from which being itself is not only reflected, but also generated. And it was Solzhenitsyn's belief, and Dostoevsky's as well, and I think Jung would have been in accordance with this, and Nietzsche as well, for that matter, that in some manner that we don't fathom, because we don't understand the structure of the world very well, the outcome of the world is dependent on our choices, and equally on all of our choices. And I don't understand. I know that to be true, or feel that to be true. It's part of the doctrine that each person is of intrinsic and equal worth. Part of that doctrine is that each person has intrinsic and equal responsibility, and that we're each capable of generating a fair bit of hell around us and for other people, but also capable of generating a tremendous amount of good, and that the fate of the world as it careens through eternity is actually a consequence of the ethical decisions of each of us. It's a terrifying idea. It's no wonder people flee from it into hedonism, let's say, and ideology, because it's very frightening possibility that the choices that you make day to day or fail to make have this profound and lasting effect on the structure of reality. But I don't really see any way out of that conclusion. One of the things I've thought about a fair bit is the meaning of the Sermon on the Mount. And as far as I can tell, it's basically a two-part wisdom. The first is that you should aim at the highest good that you can imagine. And that would be a good that includes everyone, right? So if I wanted what was good for you, say, if I genuinely wanted it, I'd want it in a way that was good for you now and good in the long run and good for you and your family and your community and maybe good for me too. You know, you could conceive of that as the desire. And I think that's a good definition of love, is that you actually want the best possible outcome. And in the Gospels, of course, that's extended even to your enemies.
Yes.
Right? Is that, okay, if we're going to have things good, let's have it good enough for even the people that set themselves up against me. Because if the world was running properly, things would be good for them too. And that would be better. And it seems to me that that's a very good way of looking at things. It's a difficult way of looking at things. And then the second part of the Sermon on the Mount is something like, having established that as your aim, which is no easy thing, by the way, right? Because you have to be pretty clear-headed and single-minded to actually want that to be your aim. Then you can concentrate on the day and you can try telling the truth. And you can ally, so there's truth and love that are allied together. Truth, love, and attention, it's something like that are all allied together. With regards to transgressing against the vulnerable. If you're plagued by bouts of depression and anxiety, that does destabilize your identity. So it's almost by definition. But having said that, look, this is when habit and plan and strategy are so useful. So in the periods of depression that I've had, and some of them were long and certainly the most unpleasant experiences of my life. This is when you need a philosophy, let's say, that's allied with your vision and your strategy to sustain you. Because what would happen to me is that, I have a vision, and I suppose the vision is of a world that's better, that's less likely to descend into ideological catastrophe, and where people are more responsible and more awake and more educated and healthier. All of that, a vision of a better world, a world that's less hellish at least, but also a better world, and some sense of what role I might play in that. And so that's very motivating. Like, it's a profound goal to try to make things better. And you can do that locally. You can do that for yourself. You can do that for your family. You can do that for the broader community. And all of that's worth it, man. It's worth making some sacrifices for. It's worth suffering for to some degree. And then you decompose that into the day-to-day and week-to-week strategies and actions that you're undertaking, the plans and the activities that you're putting forward to make that dream a reality, to realize it. And then when the depression and anxiety come along, you think, part of it with depression, it's just bloody endurance. It's like you get up and you work through the next hour. You try to stay on track. You try to implement your strategic plans to the best of your ability. And you hope and you pray that you'll get through it. You'll get through it and that the darkness will recede. And you stay on track. You eat even though you're not hungry. You get up even though you want to stay in bed. You interact with people even though you'd rather be alone. And it's the benefit of disciplined habits can sustain you. It's like the boat you're rowing in through a terrible storm, leaks and all, and maybe you'll be overwhelmed, but you have the boat and you can row forward, and that's what you've got. And so endurance is a huge part of it. And then I would say with its anxiety, it's the same thing. It's like, or very much the same, as you're terrified and uncertain, but you move ahead to the best of your ability. And again, you operate at least to some degree on hope. And if you haven't got hope, then you've got blind, bloody endurance. And that's all motivated by some sense that you're working towards something that's worthwhile working toward, and that is, well, that's your own long-term well-being. to treat yourself properly. It's the stability and productivity and harmony and health of your family. That's a huge deal. And then it's whatever benefit you can be to the community. And if you have to limp along and drag yourself forward in order to maintain that pathway, then so be it. Because it's better than the alternative.
You don't have to necessarily have done anything wrong for things to get completely out of control. It's a terrifying doctrine, but it's not a hopeless doctrine because it still says that there's a way forward, there's a pathway forward, and the pathway forward is to adopt a mode of being that has some nobility so that you can tolerate yourself and perhaps even have some respect for yourself as someone who's capable of standing up in the face of that terrible vulnerability and suffering, and that the pathway forward, as far as the existentialists are concerned, is by, well, certainly by the avoidance of deceit, particularly in language, but also by the adoption of responsibility for the conditions of existence and some attempt on your part to actually rectify them. And the thing that's so interesting about that is, well, two, as far as I'm concerned, and some of this is from clinical experience. You know, if you take people, and I've told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world and another way that you could act in the world. So what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. My experience is with people that we're probably running at about 51% of our capacity. Something, I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste or how many hours a week you waste. And the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week, it's 100 hours a month, that's 2.5 full work weeks, it's half a year of work weeks per year. And if your time is worth $20 an hour, which is a radical underestimate, it's probably more like 50 if you think about it in terms of deferred wages. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're wasting $50,000 a year. And you are doing that right now. And it's because you're young, wasting $50,000 a year is a way bigger catastrophe than it would be for me to waste it, because I'm not going to last nearly as long. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be who knows how much more efficient? 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's off the charts. Well, and if we all got our act together collectively and stopped making things worse, because that's another thing people do all the time, not only do they not do what they should to make things better, they actively attempt to make things worse because they're spiteful or resentful or arrogant or deceitful or homicidal or genocidal or all of those things all bundled together in an absolutely pathological package. If people stopped really, really trying just to make things worse, we have no idea how much better they would get just because of that. So there's this weird dynamic that's part of the existential system of ideas between human vulnerability, social judgment, both of which are major causes of suffering, and the failure of individuals to adopt the responsibility that they know they should adopt It isn't merely that your fate depends on whether or not you get your act together and to what degree you decide that you're going to live out your own genuine being. It isn't only your fate, it's the fate of everyone that you're networked with. And so, you know, you think, well, there's 9 billion, 7 billion people in the world. We're going to peak at about 9 billion, by the way, and then it'll decline rapidly, but 7 billion people in the world, and who are you? You're just one little dust mote among that 7 billion, and so it really doesn't matter what you do or don't do, but that's simply not the case. It's the wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network. Of course, that's even more true now that we have social media. You'll know 1,000 people, at least over the course of your life. And they'll know 1,000 people each, and that puts you one person away from 1 million, and 2 persons away from 1 billion. And so that's how you're connected, and the things you do, they're like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples move outward, and they affect things in ways that you can't fully comprehend, and it means that the things that you do and that you don't do are far more important than you think. And so if you act that way, of course, the terror of realizing that is that it actually starts to matter what you do. And you might say, well, that's better than living a meaningless existence. It's better for it to matter. But I mean, if you really asked yourself, would you be so sure if you had the choice? I can live with no responsibility whatsoever. The price I pay is that nothing matters. Or I can reverse it and everything matters. But I have to take the responsibility that's associated with that. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. You know, when you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life and they still suffer. Yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic. All my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out. And the price you pay is some meaningless suffering, but you can always whine about that and people will feel sorry for you, and you have the option of taking the pathway of the martyr, so that's a pretty good deal, all things considered, especially when the alternative is to bear your burden properly and to live forthrightly in the world. Well, what Solzhenitsyn figured out, and so many people in the 20th century, it's not just him, even though he's the best example, is that if you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really. Really. And you can read the Gulag Archipelago if you have the fortitude to do that, and you'll see exactly what hell is like. And then you can decide if that's a place you'd like to visit, or even more importantly, if it's a place you'd like to visit and take all your family and friends. Because that's what happened in the 20th century. I started to pay very careful attention to what I was saying. I don't know if that happened voluntarily or involuntarily, but I could feel a sort of split developing in my psyche, and the split, and I've actually had students tell me the same thing that has happened to them after they've listened to some of the material that I've been describing to all of you. But I split into two, let's say, and one part was let's say the old me that was talking a lot and that liked to argue and that liked ideas. And there was another part that was watching that part, like just with its eyes open and neutrally judging. And the part that was neutrally judging was watching the part that was talking and going, that isn't your idea. You don't really believe that. You don't really know what you're talking about. That isn't true. And I thought, that's really interesting. So now and that was happening to like 95% of what I was saying. And so then I didn't really know what to do. I thought, okay, this is strange. So maybe I've fragmented, and that's just not a good thing at all. I mean, it wasn't like I was hearing voices or anything like that. I mean, it wasn't like that. It was, well, people have multiple parts. So then I had this weird conundrum. It was like, well, which of these two things are me? Is it the part that's listening and saying, no, that's rubbish, that's a lie, you're doing that to impress people, you're just trying to win the argument, you know. Was that me, or was the part that was going about my normal verbal business me? And I didn't know, but I decided I would go with the critic. And then what I tried to do, what I learned to do, I think, was to stop saying things that made me weak. And now I mean, I'm still trying to do that because I'm always feeling when I talk whether or not the words that I'm saying are either making me align or making me come apart.
And I think the alignment, I really do think the alignment I think alignment is the right way of conceptualizing it, because I think if you say things that are as true as you can say them, let's say, then they come out of the depths inside of you. Because we don't know where thoughts come from. We don't know how far down into your substructure the thoughts emerge. We don't know what processes of physiological alignment are necessary for you to speak from the core of your being. We don't understand any of that. We don't even conceptualize that, but I believe that you can feel that. And I learned some of that from reading Carl Rogers, by the way, who's a great clinician, because he talked about mental health in part as the coherence between the spiritual or the abstract and the physical, that the two things were aligned. And there's a lot of idea of alignment in psychoanalytic and clinical thinking. But anyways, I decided that I would start practicing not saying things that would make me weak. And what happened was that I had to stop saying almost everything that I was saying. I would say 95% of it. It's a hell of a shock to wake up and I mean, this was over a few months, but it's a hell of a shock to wake up and realize that you're mostly dead wood. It's a shock, you know, and you might think, well, do you really want all of that to burn off? It's like, well, there's nothing left but a little husk, 5% of you. It's like, well, if that 5% is solid, then maybe that's exactly what you want to have happen.
Adopt the mode of authentic being. And that is something like refusing to participate in the lie, in deception in the lie, to orient your speech as much as you can towards the truth, and to take responsibility for your own life and perhaps also for the lives of other people. And there's something about that that's meaningful and responsible and noble, but also serves to mitigate the very suffering that produces, say, the nihilism or the flee into the arms of or the escape into the arms of totalitarians to begin with. You need something to shelter you against your own vulnerability.
Sometimes, you know, I can't sleep at night because I'm thinking about something, and usually what I'll do is go write it down. I have some writing to do, so I get up and I go write down what I'm thinking, and that usually does the trick. But because I had been playing with YouTube, I thought, well, I'll try making YouTube video and telling people what I'm thinking about and see if that performs the same function as writing. And to me, the function of writing, well, it's twofold. One is conceivably to communicate with people, although the fundamental purpose for me is to clarify my thoughts so that I know, because if something is disturbing you, what that means is that it needs to be articulated. It's the emergence of unexplored territory, something that disturbs you. That's the right way to think about it. It's unmapped territory that's manifesting itself. It's like a vista of threat and possibility, and you need to articulate a path through it. And so that's what I was doing. It's like I was thinking, well, this is bothering me, and this seems to be why, and here's what I think is going on, and so I made the videos, and in some sense, I didn't think anything more of it.
The next best predictor of lifetime success is conscientiousness. Well, and of the two aspects of conscientiousness, say orderliness and industriousness, the better predictor is industriousness. So the question is, well, what can you do about your industriousness? And the answer to that is, well, that's kind of rough too, because there's a strong genetic component. But you can work on micro habits with regards to your conscientiousness. And I think the best micro habits, this is partly to do with this future authoring program processes, I think the best thing you can do with regards to your conscientiousness is to set up some aims for yourself, goals that you actually value. And the future authoring program helps people do that. And basically, it does a situational analysis it helps you do a situational analysis of your life more than a psychological analysis, I would say. And so the questions are something like, well, all right, you're going to have to put some effort into your life. And you need to be motivated to do that. And so what are the potential sources of motivation? Well, you could think about them in the big five manner. You know, if you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high neuroticism, you want security. Okay, so those are all sources of potential motivation that you could draw on, that you could tailor to your own, your own personality. But then there are dimensions that you want to consider your life across. And so we ask people about, well, you know, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, you know, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health, and maybe also your drug and alcohol use, because that's a good place to auger down, you know, because alcoholism, for example, wipes out, you know, 5 to 10% of people. So you want to keep that under control. And then so maybe, you know, you develop a vision of what you would like your life to be, and that associates the goal. Well, once the goal is established, and then you break down the goal into micro processes that you can implement, the micro processes become rewarding in proportion, in relation to their causal association with the goal, and that tangles in your incentive reward system. You know, we talked about the dopaminergic incentive reward system, and that's the thing that keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it works better if it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day, you're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal. Maybe you also specify a place you want to stay the hell away from, so that you're terrified to fail as well as excited about succeeding, because that's also useful. You specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. And then the next question might be, well, where should you look for worthwhile things? And one would be, well, you could consult your own temperament. And the other would be, well, you kind of look at what it is that people accrue that's valuable across the lifespan. So you do a structural analysis of the subcomponents of human existence, and I already did that. You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, you know, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. You know, that's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. So once you set up that goal structure, let's say, and that's really in many ways that's what you should be doing at university. That's exactly what you should be doing, is trying to figure out who it is that you're trying to be, right? And you aim at that, and then you use everything you learn as a means of building that person that you want to be. And I really mean want to be. I don't mean should be, even those things are going to overlap. And it's important to distinguish between those, because that's partly, and this is back down to the micro routine analysis. So as I was saying, well, you're going to try to make yourself more industrious. Okay, number one, specify your damn goals, because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too, because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy, because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail, because that's painful. So I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. So I would recommend that you don't let that happen. So that's willful blindness, right? You could have known, but you chose not to. Okay, so once you get your goal structure set up, you think, okay, if I could have this life, it looks like that might be worth living, despite the fact that it's going to be, you know, anxiety provoking and threatening, and there's going to be some suffering and loss involved and all of that. Obviously, the goal is to have a vision for your life such that, all things considered, that justifies your effort.
When I was 25 or so, I probably weighed about 138 pounds. I smoked like a pack of cigarettes a day. I drank tremendous amount of alcohol. I was from northern Alberta, this rough little town up in northern Alberta called Fairview, and there were long winters there, and my friends were heavy drinkers, and most of them dropped out of school by the time they were 15 or 16, went off to work on the oil rigs, and it was a rough town, and we drank a lot. I started when I was 14, and and so I had a lot of bad habits, let's say, and things and I wasn't in great shape physically, and I was also still intellectually obsessed as I am now, and so that would have been in 85. But I decided around then, about 85, 84, something like that, maybe a little earlier, that I was really going to try to get my act together, and so I started doing that. First of all, I quit smoking. Well, that took a long time because I eventually had to quit drinking too in order to quit smoking, and I started working out, and playing sports, which I'd never done. I had a fine time when I was a kid, but I needed really to get disciplined, and I had to do it because I was working on these hard problems that I've been discussing with all of you, and I've been working on them really, obsessively since I was probably about 18, maybe even earlier than that, and got to the point around 25 when I was in graduate school trying to get my PhD, doing all my research. Like, I published 15 papers by the time I graduated with my PhD, which was by a fairly large measure the most papers that any graduate student at that time had ever published at McGill. I think that's right. It might have been twice as many, or maybe twice as many, maybe even 3 times as many. And at the same time, I wrote Maps of Meaning, which was a terribly difficult thing to do, because I was writing about 3 hours a day doing that, and I couldn't do all that and continue with my misbehavior, my sort of, what would you say, my massive hedonistic consumption of alcohol and all of that. I just couldn't keep it up, and also work seriously on the issues that were at hand. So, I had to stop. That's a sacrifice. I had to stop messing about and straighten myself out. Because people think that the purpose of memory is to remember the past. And that's not the purpose of memory. The purpose of memory is to extract out from the past lessons to structure the future. And that's the purpose of personal memory. And so you're done with a memory when you've extracted out the information that you can use to guide yourself properly in the future. So if you have a traumatic memory, for example, that's really obsessing you, if you analyze that memory to the point where you figured out how you put yourself at risk and you can determine how you might avoid that in the future, then the emotion associated with that goes away. So memory has a very pragmatic function. And cultural memory is the same thing, is that we need to extract out stories from our past that structure our future. And we need that because, well, first of all, if you don't have a purpose, let's say, it isn't that your life becomes neutral in a meaningless sense. It's that your life becomes characterized by unbearable suffering, because the baseline condition of life is something like unbearable suffering. And what you have to set against that is a noble and worthwhile purpose. And hopefully your determination of that purpose is buttressed to some degree by the wisdom of the past, because you can't conjure something like that up on your own. And if you provide people with nobility of purpose, then they can tolerate the suffering of existence without becoming entirely corrupted by it. And cultures that don't do that, it isn't even so much that they die, it's that cultures that don't do that are dead. They're done. They don't have a story anymore. And they don't have a call to adventure. And then, well, then everyone suffers stupidly as a consequence. It's a very bad thing. So Churchill made the same observation that many of the great psychologists and philosophers made in the early part of the 20th century. It's like, bring the story forward and propagate it and make it the most noble possible story, and then you motivate people to transcend themselves, which they need to do. So yes, he's exactly right in his diagnosis.
You're going to have to put some effort into your life, and you need to be motivated to do that. And so what are the potential sources of motivation? Well, you could think about them in the big 5 manner. If you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high in neuroticism, you want security. Okay, so those are all sources of potential motivation that you could draw on, that you could tailor to your own, your own personality. But then there are dimensions that you want to consider your life across. And so we ask people about, well, you know, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, you know, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health, and maybe also your drug and alcohol use, because that's a good place to auger down, you know, because alcoholism, for example, wipes out, you know, 5 to 10% of people. So you want to keep that under control. And then so maybe, you know, you develop a vision of what you would like your life to be, and that associates the goal. Well, once the goal is established, and then you break down the goal into micro processes that you can implement, the micro processes become rewarding in proportion, in relation to their causal association with the goal, and that tangles in your incentive reward system. You know, we talked about the dopaminergic incentive reward system, and that's the thing that keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it works better if it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day, you're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal. Maybe you also specify a place you want to stay the hell away from, so that you're terrified to fail as well as excited about succeeding, because that's also useful. You specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. And then the next question might be, well, where should you look for worthwhile things? And one would be, well, you could consult your own temperament. And the other would be, well, you kind of look at what it is that people accrue that's valuable across the lifespan. So you do a structural analysis of the subcomponents of human existence, and I already did that. You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, you know, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. You know, that's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you.
There's an entire literature, psychoanalytic literature, on the dangers of overcompassion, hyperprotectiveness, helicopter parenting, all of that. When you have children, you have to encourage them. You have to encourage them to take risks, because they have to grow up and take their place in the world. You can't protect them too much, because if you do, you destroy them. That's the motif of Hansel and Gretel, right? 2 kids lost in the woods. They find the gingerbread house. That's a little bit too good to be true, right? It's not only shelter when you need it, but it's candy. What lives inside the house that's too good to be true? The witch that devours you, right? That's excess compassion. So you don't want your mother to do everything for you, that's for sure. There's a rule if you're dealing with the elderly in like extended care homes. Don't do anything for your clients that they can do themselves, because you undermine their autonomy. And so there's a certain amount of harshness that goes along with that, just as there is if you're a good mother, because you have to separate yourself from your child and allow them to make hurtful mistakes, right? I mean, it's very difficult if you're a compassionate person to stand back far enough to let your children take necessary risks.
But one thing I'm not getting, there's a big difference between letting people do something for themselves and saying men should be dangerous. By dangerous, that implies I should be ready to threaten someone, to hurt somebody.
No, you should be capable of it. But that doesn't mean you should use it. There's nothing to you otherwise. Like, if you're not a formidable force, there's no morality in your self-control. If you're incapable of violence, not being violent isn't a virtue. People who teach martial arts know this full well, right? If you learn a martial art, you learn to be dangerous, but simultaneously you learn to control it. Both of those come together. And the combination of that capacity for danger and the capacity for control is what brings about the virtue. Otherwise, you confuse weakness with moral virtue. I'm harmless, therefore I'm good. It's like, no, that isn't how it works.
That isn't how it works at all. If you're harmless, you're just weak. And if you're weak, you're not going to be good. You can't be, because it takes strength to be good. It's very difficult to be good. Becoming more articulate is definitely, I would say, that's the primary array of weapons. So, I mean, physical prowess is something, and it's not nothing, that physical confidence that comes along with that as well. But the same thing replicated at the level of the ability to communicate and to think, that's a way broader field of battle and opportunity. So this is one thing that isn't taught well, especially to boys. It's more important to teach it to boys, I would say, because they're more skeptical of the educational enterprise in general, generally speaking, partly because they're less obedient, partly because they're less agreeable. That's particularly true for disagreeable boys. And agreeable boys get higher grades independent of their IQ and their academic achievement, because they're easier to deal with. So what do you tell disagreeable boys? There's nothing that makes you more formidable than verbal competence, than being able to articulate, be able to think, to marshal your arguments, right? It's a battlefield metaphor, to get everything in order, get all your information straight, to marshal your forces. And so, I mean, that's part of the reason that rap artists are so popular, especially among disaffected young men, black and white alike, because they're unbelievably articulate. Like, they have this incredible verbal prowess. It's unbelievably attractive, and it's associated with genuine artistic and redemptive activity, often focusing on something that's approximately the voice of the underclass, let's say, but a powerful voice, right? And it's interesting to see how many young white guys identify with that. That's why humility is always stressed in great religious traditions. Humility is precisely that. It's like you have to look at why you're not so good.
Yeah.
That has to break down your pride to some degree and your arrogance. It's like, well, that's great, because if you break down your pride and your arrogance, then you're primed to learn and you can solve your problems. So there's nothing in that. It's a bit crushing to begin with, because you might think, oh my God, there's really a lot of things wrong with me.
Yes.
But at least then you're on the road to fixing them.
What's the best method to retain what you read and to be able to use it in conversation? Oh, well, it's very difficult really to retain anything without recalling it. So look, if you encounter something and then you encounter it again, you can usually recognize that you've encountered it before. That's recognition memory. So it's an important form of memory. It's the memory that's associated with familiarity, but it's not the same as being able to use something exactly. It's a rather shallow form of memory, even though it's necessary. In order to be able to use something, you have to recall it. And this is also a very useful hint for studying. Like, if you're studying and you have to remember, what you want to do is study, and then you want to write down what you just learned. So you read a paragraph, you close the book, and you write down what you remember. Or you read a chapter and you close the book and you write down what you remembered. Or at least you sit there and you try to remember, because the way you remember is by practicing remembering. Okay, so if you're reading and you want to use it in conversation, then you have to think about what you read. You have to put it in your own words. It's often helpful to close the book and write it down, or to associate it with some problem that you're currently trying to solve. You have to take the knowledge and make it your own. And then that alters the structure through which you look at the world, and that changes the way that you think, so that when you have a conversation the next time, that you're going to have the conversation in a different way. So merely reading isn't enough. You have to read and think and recall. And it's the act of recalling that produces the remembering, and it's that act of remembering that puts that material at hand for you.
Let's say you want to fix up your house, which is actually quite a lot like fixing yourself up, which is a very common dream metaphor.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing you want to do is
go look around and see what needs to be fixed. You know, and the interesting thing about that, and this is akin to what comedians do, is that as soon as you're willing to admit, comedians look at a problem and then rise above it right away and make a joke about it, but as soon as you're willing to admit that you have a problem, then you've immediately contacted the part of yourself that's at least strong enough to admit that you have a problem. And so as soon, the act of admitting the problem is actually the first step to solving it.
Yes.
You might say, well, and it's an optimistic step, because you might say, oh my God, I can't admit that I have a problem, because what if I can't solve it? Well, exactly. So then maybe you won't admit to it. If you do admit to it, you're simultaneously admitting to the possibility that you could solve it.
Yes.
And then it can actually become something that's optimistic. You can say, well, my life is horrible. It's like, okay, but I'm doing 50 things wrong. Well, great, I could fix those things, and then maybe it wouldn't be so horrible.
I've watched the audiences very carefully and listened to them to see what resonates and what doesn't. And I think the basic argument that I've been laying out is that, well, we all have difficult lives, you know, that life is characterized in large part by suffering. There's an inevitable element of suffering in life. I mean, obviously that's symbolized in Christianity by the crucifixion, which is a very harsh symbol. And not only is life sorrowful in part, but it's also touched by malevolence, and malevolence of each of us, and the malevolence of our social creations, our societies, and even in some sense the kind of blind malevolence of nature. And so it's a demanding occupation to exist as a human being, and you need something to sustain yourself through that. It's not optional, because the price of existence is so high that without that sustaining meaning, it corrupts you, it embitters you, and once you're embittered, things go downhill rapidly. You get vengeful and you get angry and you get destructive, and there's really no limit to that. And I've been suggesting to people that the sustaining meaning that they can find in their life isn't to be found through happiness, let's say, because happiness doesn't work when you're not happy, when things have gone badly for you, even for accidental reasons. But you can find sustaining meaning in responsibility, and you can take responsibility for yourself. You can do that. And if you take responsibility for yourself, you treat yourself as if you're someone that's worthy of care and discipline. And that has nothing to do with being soft on yourself or the pursuit of pleasure, any of those things. You can take responsibility for yourself, and that works. And then if you do that properly, you can take responsibility for your family. And then if you do that properly, you can take responsibility for your community, and you can continue to burden yourself voluntarily, let's say, with a greater and greater range of existential challenges. And all that does is make more and more and more of you. And that works as an antidote to the catastrophe of life.
Because you made it this far in a video, I want to celebrate you. Most people start and don't finish. Most people never actually follow through. Most people say they want something, but they don't ever do the work to actually get it. But you are different. You are special. Believe Nation, you made it here all the way to the end, and I love you. So as a special celebration, if you put a hashtag believe down in the comments below on this video, I will showcase you and celebrate you somewhere on the screen in a future video, because you are awesome. For 50 more amazing rules from Jordan Peterson, check the video right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
So what Jung thought, his idea was something like this, that at the beginning of time, people were unconscious, and that consciousness emerged with all of its catastrophes, consciousness of death, for example. And